Good evening. I'm Teresa Skubik, and this is Forum Daily for Thursday, January 2nd. The FBI says it has recovered the stark black flag of the Islamic State extremist group from the pickup truck that a U.S. Army veteran from Texas smashed into New Year's partygoers in New Orleans. Wednesday morning's attack killed 15 people and injured dozens more. The rampage turned festive Bourbon Street into a grim scene of victims, bloodied bodies, and pedestrians fleeing for safety inside bars and restaurants. During an address in Maryland on Wednesday, U.S. President Joe Biden said Americans' hearts are with the people of New Orleans.
After the despicable attack that occurred in the early morning hours, to all the families of those who were killed, to all those who were injured, to all the people of New Orleans who are grieving today, I want you to know, I grieve with you. Our nation grieves with you. We're going to stand with you as you mourn and as you heal in the weeks to come. I want to thank our brave first responders and law enforcement personnel who stopped the attacker in his tracks before he could kill or injure even more people. And I want to thank you to everyone at the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, including the FBI, for working nonstop to investigate this heinous act.
Andrew Donaldson from OrdinaryTimes.com has more on what is known about the attack.
And we know he was an Army veteran. We know that he was a U.S. citizen. And we know that this has already caused problems with how this story is being reported and covered and investigated. There's a couple layers here we got to peel through. One is the initial reaction to this. The press conference was an absolute disaster where they had the FBI director overriding the mayor on whether this was or wasn't a terrorist attack. You had a U.S. senator jumping in and taking over when he really didn't have any relevant information. The communication on these things needs to be a lot better because it just feeds the conspiracy theories and the hot mess online on top of it, because everybody goes online and starts snooping for what is or is not the background of this particular individual. Now, as the investigation rolls out, we're starting to find out some things that still need to be delved into, but it does look like this is an individual who had a mostly normal life and somewhere along the line got himself radicalized either online or with a small group of supporters, and this will have to be investigated out. Now, this leads to the physical security of what happened here. Perversely enough, New Orleans was actually redoing their security plan for the upcoming Super Bowl in February, and that's one of the ways that he actually got down into Bourbon Street in the first place. So those sorts of things have to be addressed. And then, of course, we have the terrorism part of this. Is this a part of a wider scheme, or is this another individual that has broke bad? We've seen this before, places like Fort Hood, people with Army experience or military experience, and then they end up perpetrating an attack. Is there links to that sort of thing? So there's a lot to look through here. There's obviously what he claims. There looks like personal stuff, lots of layers, and we need to be patient as we peel this back and get a thorough investigation and not just fly off the handle and not be prepared for the next time one of these things happen. Local reaction is interesting here. New Orleans is, of course, a major tourist hub. It's one of the most unique cities in the entire world, not just in the U.S. And they're used to big events like this. There's a reason the Super Bowl keeps going back there. There's a reason something like the Sugar Bowl happens there every year. They're really good at hosting major events. So the locals really get concerned with things like this because, remember, this is a one-day event for the news, and it's a bad thing, but they have to have tourism year-round to keep functioning. They don't want to get a reputation for this sort of thing. The federal response to this has not been great. Communication needs to be much, much better, especially public-facing communication. I understand there are legalities why they don't want to come out and say something is terrorism because that's a very specific charge in federal law. But you also have to manage these things better and talk in a way normal people can react to and relate to. And when you have things like the FBI overriding the mayor of the city at a public press conference, that's a really bad look and something that needs to be dealt with immediately, because that affects how these investigations are portrayed in the public, and it portrays how the public in a representative democracy thinks of their government. Well, obviously, the biggest thing was you just only have so many resources. And when you have a mass casualty event, most of the city resources already had themselves a very, very long day. It was completely appropriate to postpone this at least one day. Now, you postpone it past that, you start getting into schedule conflicts, not only for the facility itself, but also the surrounding area, because you got 70,000 people coming to this thing. That's a lot of hotel and airfare and travel and things like that. You don't want to inconvenience them any more than you already have to. So I think it's appropriate to do it a one-day pushback. Plus, this is a college football playoff, so it would affect things down the line. But again, the Super Bowl's coming. New Orleans hosts a lot of events that are big events. This is something that they are good at. I think they can bounce back quickly, but the delay was appropriate. A further delay probably isn't going to gain you a whole lot.
All right, stay with us. Coming up after the break, an investigation into the Tesla Cybertruck that exploded outside Donald Trump's Las Vegas hotel on Wednesday finds that the vehicle was stuffed with firework mortars and camp fuel canisters. And 10 people were injured in a mass shooting outside a New York City nightclub on New Year's Day. We'll have these stories and more news from around the world when we return. Don't go anywhere. Forum Daily will be right back after these messages. Firework mortars and camp fuel canisters were found stuffed in the back of the Tesla Cybertruck that exploded outside U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's Las Vegas hotel early yesterday. The blast killed a suspect inside the vehicle, caused injuries to 7 people nearby, and sparked an intense investigation into possible terrorism. President Joe Biden also announced that there would be investigations to see if the New Orleans attack and this one were connected in any way.
We're tracking the explosion of a Cybertruck outside the Trump Hotel in Las Vegas. Law enforcement and the intelligence community are investigating this as well, including whether there's any possible connection with the attack in New Orleans. Thus far, there's nothing to report on that score at this time. I've directed my team to make sure every resource is made available to federal, state, and local law enforcement to complete the investigation in New Orleans quickly and to make sure there is no remaining threat to the American people.
Police say that video captured at Tesla charging stations provided by CEO Elon Musk helped authorities track the vehicle's journey. It arrived in Las Vegas at about 7:30 a.m., then drove an hour later into the valet area of the Trump International Hotel, where it sat for 15 to 20 seconds before blowing up. According to police, 10 people were injured in a New Year's Day mass shooting in New York City when a group of men opened fire on a crowd of people standing outside a nightclub in Queens.
Officers responding to the multiple 911 calls found a total of 10 victims, 6 females, 4 males, which were taken to area hospitals. All of the victims are expected to recover with non-life-threatening injuries.
About 30 shots were fired before the gunman fled by foot. They were then seen getting into a sedan with out-of-state plates. The motive still remains unknown. Local officials announced that an Israeli strike killed at least 26 people overnight, including 3 children, as well as the Director General of Gaza Police and a deputy in southern Gaza. Gaza's Interior Ministry accused Israel of killing a member of the Police Command Council to undermine law and order in the Palestinian territory. The IDF said that the officer was a terrorist who was responsible for developing intelligence assessment in coordination with elements of Hamas's military wing in Gaza. Canada has taken over this year's presidency of the Group of 7, meaning it will host world leaders in Alberta in June. Senator Peter Beam says that hosting a G7 summit is a key opportunity for Ottawa to advance its own priorities on the world stage. Canada's last presidency in 2018 rallied almost $4 billion to support education for women and girls. Canadian health officials have released more information about the BC teenager who was sickened with Canada's first human case of H5N1 avian flu. In their letter to the New England Journal of Medicine, officials say that the 13-year-old girl who tested positive for avian flu in early November has been taken off supplemental oxygen and is no longer infectious. She was taken off oxygen in BC Children's Hospital in mid-December. The source of her exposure has not yet been determined. Utah authorities have recovered the body of a Quebec snowboarder who died in an avalanche. The Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office says 38-year-old David Ethier had been splitboarding when he was swept under the snow in Saturday's avalanche. The rescue operation began Sunday evening after a family came across Mr. Ethier's dog and later found his car at a trailhead. The sheriff called the death a heartbreaking tragedy and said that his staff's hearts go out to Mr. Ethier's family. Pope Francis has ushered in 2025 with a renewed call for faithful Catholics to reject abortion. Francis is calling for a firm commitment to protect and respect life from conception to natural death. The 88-year-old pontiff celebrated a New Year's Day Mass in St. Peter's Basilica. Francis complained in the first months as Pope in 2013 that the church had become obsessed by small-minded rules about hot-button issues such as abortion. Netflix's first ever NFL Christmas Day doubleheader ended up being a streaming success globally. The Texans vs. Ravens contest averaged about 31.3 million viewers, while the Chiefs-Steelers came in at 25.8 million. The two games were also the most streamed in NFL history in the U.S. Research giant Nielsen says viewers from 218 countries and territories tuned in to at least one of the games. All right, don't go anywhere. When we come back from the commercial break, we'll be turning our attention to the latest report card on financial transparency in Canada from the C.D. Howe Institute. The report reveals stark contrast between the country's federal, provincial, and territorial governments. We were joined by President and CEO of the C.D. Howe Institute, William B.P. Robson, to discuss what they're calling on governments to do to improve their scores. Stay with us. Forum Daily will return after these messages. The C.D. Howe Institute's latest report card on the financial transparency of Canada's federal, provincial, and territorial governments has been released. The report ranks the senior governments on fiscal accountability. It revealed stark contrast between governments across the country. Alberta and Yukon topped the class in 2024 with scores of A- due to their timely releases, consistent accounting, and clear presentations. And Prince Edward Island scored the lowest with a D-. We were joined earlier by William B.P. Robson, the president and CEO of C.D. Howe Institute, to unpack the report.
We look at the financial statements and budgets that governments produce, trying to do it through the eyes of somebody who's motivated and can read numbers, but isn't an accounting expert. And the question is, how easy is it for a motivated but non-expert person to make sense of the presentations and the fiscal plans and how closely the results resembled the plan? And the good news is that some provinces and territories, Alberta and Yukon this time, do quite well. You don't have to be an expert to understand what they're up to. Unfortunately, though, there's a range of results. The federal government, which used to be excellent, has been pretty bad lately and was a C range grade this time. So there's a lot of room for improvement. And what we say in the report is, people shouldn't be embarrassed if they look at a government's budget presentation, if they look at a financial statement and it doesn't look right. People should feel confident to put their hand up and say, this doesn't look right, because it isn't necessarily the problem with you, the reader. It might be that the government isn't doing it right. Well, what's always surprising a little bit is when you see somebody drop. So I'll say, for example, in Ontario, where the financial statements and the budgets are very well presented. And so Ontario, in many ways, is operating at A level, but they're late with their stuff. And so that's disappointing. I mean, there's no excuse for delivering a budget after the fiscal year has begun. The fiscal year for the senior governments, the feds, the provinces, and the territories is April 1st. So you ought to be delivering your budget before that, ideally in February, not in April, not in May, after the fiscal year has already started. So that's a little disappointing. I'll mention the federal government as well with its C- rating. Now, a few years ago, during COVID, they never even presented a budget, which was an unprecedented fail, so they got an F. But the thing that the feds do that's so irritating in their budgets is the key numbers are literally hundreds of pages deep in the document. So if you're not an expert who knows how to look for them, you could easily get like 50 pages in and maybe either give up or maybe see the wrong numbers and think they were the right numbers, because you'd be thinking, how could the right numbers be later than this? So there are a few things that governments do that are really quite frustrating. One controversial thing that governments do is they put contingency reserves of various kinds in their budgets. It's controversial because it can look like a slush fund. On the other hand, budgeting is uncertain. Things happen, floods happen, fires happen, other things happen. And so it's what we think is that it's good to have some kind of contingency in there. It should be transparent. It should be a number that's right there in the financial statements, in the budget, rather than something that's kind of hidden. Say you shade your revenue forecast down, that's objectionable because you're kind of misleading people. So one of the things that people have commented on, and some of the governments have commented on, is what's with this contingency reserve? Because what we do is we say, if you have one, you get a mark, but if it's too big, you don't. So that's one area where there's a bit of controversy, but we think we're steering a reasonable course because it's all about transparency. You want the government to make it evident what they're doing, but it can't be too big, because if it's too big, then the bottom line forecast stops being meaningful. The thing that we would most like to see is a situation such as you do see with Alberta, Yukon, and some other governments where when you look at a budget or their end of year report, starting at page one, flipping pages, you should be in no doubt whatsoever when you get to the page that shows you all the revenues, all the expenses, what the bottom line is, and ideally on the same page, as many governments do, what that means to their accumulated debt and their capacity to deliver services. It ought to be as straightforward as that. And for the governments that do, we give them a high grade and we urge them to do more. For the governments that don't do so well, we give them a lower grade. And one of the things that we point out in the report is it's not that hard to do well. Deliver your budget on time, put the key numbers up front where people can read them. And right away there, you're well on your way to a B. There are a few more things you need to do to get an A, but it's not hard for governments to do this right. And when they're not doing it, you really have to question why wouldn't they make it easy for people to understand the numbers?
All right, stay tuned. We'll have more of today's top news right after the break. Stay with us. A Northern Ontario site has been picked to hold Canada's nuclear waste in a deep geological repository. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization says it chose Ignis after both the town and the nearby First Nation decided to move ahead with the $26 million project that began over a decade ago. It estimates regulatory approvals will take about 10 years each, and the used fuel will be loaded in over a period of about 50 to 60 years. We were joined earlier by Jake Pastore, communications lead for the township of Ignis, about why it was chosen for the project.
Well, the township of Ignis has been working on this project back in 2010 when the NWMO first went out and put up its hand and said, are there interested communities that might suit the technical requirements for a deep geological repository? Ignis put up its hand. And in fact, Mayor Kim Bakery and another councillor, John Taddeo, were both on council, and they're still on current council. And so for the last 14 years, they have been working to really get all of the information together for the community. And it's been an educational journey. They've been learning about the project. They've been educating themselves. They've traveled to see sites around the world. We've basically have gone to even uranium mines to see how the process the process is undertaken. And so they've educated themselves, and we feel that the NWMO, they had a willing this year. We had three big milestones events in Ignis. One was we signed an agreement on March 18th of 2024 with the NWMO. And then on July 10th, the municipality did a vote on the process. And there were 77.3% of the community said, yes, we want to move forward in this process to be a host community for the Deep Geological Repository. So they were a very strong mandated community. And we also have a very strong, the people of the Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation voted, and they had a strong mandate to move to the next phase of this project. So NWMO had two very strong partners in Northwestern Ontario, and I believe that was one of them, other than all the technical reasons for having a site that can actually host deep geological repository and use nuclear fuel. That was probably the reason that we were chosen.
We also discussed what the project means for the community.
First and foremost, I think Mayor and Council want to thank all of the people, the volunteers, the past mayors, community councils, volunteers, the Ignis that had the confidence in the community and the township to actually move this project forward. But it is just moving it forward along the continuum of the NWMO schedule, which now basically that they've chosen the sites and are both of our communities, it goes into a licensing and regulation process that could take 7 to 10 years. So it's a very stringent and rigorous process to get a license by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Association and Atomic Energy to be able to actually get the license to build this facility. In the meantime, there's going to be a lot of different things that are going to be happening over the course of the next few years, including the potential to have a center of expertise built right in Ignis. That's probably the next big visual piece that will come as a part of this project, will be an anchor that for this project is situated and built in the township of Ignis. And so at any given time, there could be 700 to 1,000 jobs associated to this project. It's $26 billion. So we want to make sure, as the township of Ignis, that we're positioned well in the next few years to be able to become a part of that procurement stream for the NWMO, and that we're working hand in hand with NWMO and of course with our partners at the Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation, because both of us have to sort of keep moving along that process for environmental assessments, for all kinds of different assessments that need to be done. And so we're ready to move that bar forward, and we're thrilled to be actually involved in this big project. It's a once in a lifetime project. For a community of 1,300 along the Trans-Canada Highway, it is a once in a lifetime project, and they've capitalized on taking advantage of this project.
I'm Teresa Skubik. Good night, Canada.